The most fundamental concept of Prometheism is that of being bound for freedom. This concept is a triple entendre. The name for it is polyvalent and signifies three facets or integrally unified aspects of a single idea. Here, these three facets of the concept of being bound for freedom will be fleshed out in the context of an examination of freedom as an epistemological problem, a consideration of the theological implications of free will, the ontology of freedom, the relationship of freedom and creativity as relevant to aesthetics, ending with reflections on what the freedom-fighting ethos means in the context of a revolutionary call for a Promethean political order. Firstly, being bound for freedom means being or existence bound or held together in a structure that allows for freedom in the sense of free will. In other words, it is how being would have to be bounded or delimited by a certain finite but open structure for us to have at least some degree of free choice and self-determination in how we think and act. This finitude is ultimately a dynamic process of becoming, such that being is not static, complete, or eternal. Being is only ever becoming, or a being bound for. This facet of being bound for freedom is both ontological and epistemological. It has to do with the structure of existence and the theory of knowledge. Scientists do not give enough thought to the problem of free will or the question of whether they have any. If they were genuinely convinced that the mechanistic, reductionist paradigm that they operate on the basis of were legitimate, they would despair of getting up in the morning to continue their research. What goal in life could possibly motivate them to pursue a career in science if, in fact, we have no intentions whatsoever? The question of free will is not just a question of evident actions in the world that would be attributable to oneself. Even to coherently pursue a line of thought involves a degree of intentionality that presupposes free will. Otherwise, thoughts would just be something that happened to us. There is something profoundly absurd about that. We take our trains of thought to have meaning and to lead to various discoveries and developments. All of that would be completely senseless if we did not have any free will, if our actions were either thoroughly determined or to some extent random. It is not as if a replacement of the thoroughgoing determinism under the Newtonian paradigm with a degree of statistical randomness after quantum mechanics is a change in the structure of knowledge that is going to give us free will. There is a fringe interpretation of quantum mechanics forwarded by a small minority of physicists and by many others in the marginal field of parapsychology, which allows for psi ability to influence the indeterminism in the cosmos at a quantum level in a way that is consistent with the idea of free will. However, the standard interpretations of quantum mechanics are really mechanics of one form or another. On these interpretations, quantum theory just involves a degree of statistical randomness and deals in probabilities rather than the ironclad determinism of the Newtonian world. Interpreting a person's actions as partly determined and partly random does not secure free will any more effectively than to posit that the actions putatively attributable to this individual are a product of pure determinism or are always and only random. A person whose actions are entirely random is not a person who has goals and is pursuing them in a coherent way. His life cannot be taken to have the internal coherence that would allow us to ascribe motive and intentionality to these actions. Randomness augmenting determinism is not going to give us the structure of intentional behavior that could be legitimately described as free will. The core of the problem has to do with denying a teleology of human behavior. Aristotle makes the point that telos, a goal, aim, or end, is fundamental to human life. A person is motivated by certain goals and driven by experiences that have happened uniquely to him. His cultivation of his character involves a certain interpretation of those experiences and a pursuit of certain life goals in a way that is consistent with a personality that is developed over time. That is not at all compatible with a view of human action as the outcome of random events on a quantum level. Of course, it is also not compatible with the old school determinism operating on elementary particles, corpuscles, in accordance with laws of nature. There are, however, branches of science that cannot dispense with purpose and see it as integral to their domain of research. Sciences such as psychology and sociology integrally presuppose purpose and would be incomprehensible without an analysis of the motivations and intentions of purposeful actors who are at least somewhat personally responsible for what they do. Even the most deterministic theories about how societies are organized and how they transform presupposes some degree of human intentionality. But the problem is that the various sciences have been hierarchically arranged in a way that makes fundamental physics determinative of the overall structure of scientific knowledge. Everything is at least tacitly, if not explicitly, presumed to be reducible to the dynamics of physics. It is assumed that biological, psychological, sociological, and other types of scientific explanations are more superficial, and that the ultimate laws at work in the events explained would be physical laws acting on elementary entities, particles, waves, etc. The established belief is that if we only had an analytical ability up to the task, we could reduce these fuzzier scientific accounts of the workings of minds and societies to the incredibly complex physical interactions underlying them. In order to remedy this reductionism, it is not enough to restructure the relationship between the sciences. The relationship between the sciences could be rearranged so that it is not a hierarchical one. Or, if it remains hierarchical, psychology rather than physics could be seen as the highest or most fundamental science. But a new physics is also needed as a precondition for such a restructuring to even take place. The denial of free will is not limited to secular individuals who are scientifically inclined. In the West and in the Islamic world as well, free will is also implicitly, if not explicitly, denied by religious believers who have faith in the existence of an omniscient and omnipotent God. Even outside of the so-called revealed religions, the single largest group of people who believe in a supreme being are Hindus, whose conception of Brahman is at least as problematic for free will as the Judeo-Christian or Islamic ideas of God Almighty. An all-knowing and all-powerful God does not allow for free will. The very concept of such an entity is logically incompatible with free will. An all-powerful God has all the power in the world. In that case, the human individual does not add anything to the cosmos. No action is ascribable to a particular person. All of the action in the cosmos is effectively the action of this all-powerful being. Furthermore, for God to be all-knowing would mean that the mind's eye of such a deity is always already capable of surveying all future events. This is tantamount to the fact that our universe and any other parallel worlds would be a closed nexus of possibilities that will inevitably be actualized over the course of time. Consequently, we as individuals, any one of us as an individual, never creates anything or brings anything into being that was not already determined to be actualized. So, faith in an all-knowing and all-powerful God is also incompatible with free will. Finally, the belief that an almighty God can grant the individual free will as a miracle is a piece of sheer nonsense that is not even worth dignifying with thoughtful consideration. This means that a majority of people on the face of the earth, either secular scientifically inclined people or religious believers in one or another idea of a supreme being, deny that they have any fundamental freedom. It is not just a question of the fact that most people are not logically consistent most of the time. We have to ask why it is that the majority of people on earth at least implicitly believe that they do not have any fundamental freedom. Why do so many people hold beliefs that implicitly deny free will? Consider how outrageous this is in light of the fact that every legal system presumes free will. One would think that the denial of free will would render a criminal justice system incoherent, since no person could be legitimately held responsible for any action. But then, of course, in both Judeo-Christianity and Islam, there is the notion that God is all-powerful and therefore God is responsible for everything that happens. And yet, you will be judged for actions that God performed through you, and if these deeds are sufficiently sinful, you will burn in hell forever. A planet full of people who subscribe to beliefs, religious or scientific, that tacitly deny them any metaphysical freedom is a planet where it would be very easy to imprison people. The first thing that one would want to do to an entire planetary population before imprisoning them is to shatter their fundamental faith in their own spiritual freedom. Even if the imprisoned population were to become aware of their angelic warders, such a psychosocial conditioning would make them feel as if resistance would be futile. Free will is only possible in a cosmos constituted by a plurality of independent forces, which are never fully integrated into a single overarching logical framework, and which continue to struggle with one another indefinitely over the definition of reality. The pluralistic panpsychism of William James epitomizes such a view, but it can be found as far back as Heraclitus, when the Greek concept of logos, or universal meaning, was first being defined. Another shining example is the perspectival power struggle fundamental to the ontology of Nietzsche, so long as his idea of eternal recurrence is not misinterpreted as anything other than an ethical thought experiment. To the extent that there is a tacit ontology in the epistemological writings of Charles Fort, it is also of this kind. Logic goes back to the Greek concept of logos. It is the fabric or texture of meaning that binds together the cosmos. For free will, one needs a logos that is not a completed matrix of logical possibilities that are bound to be actualized in time, at least in one of many possible dimensions. Whether in the case of scientific materialism or of religious belief in an omniscient and omnipotent God, the real problem of free will comes down to a conception of cosmic order that involves a completed logical matrix. James's ontology does not face this problem, because its starting point is a plurality of independent forces that only in struggle with one another bring the cosmos into being. That affords us the opportunity to add to the world as genuinely creative agents contributing to the co-constitution of the cosmos. I have been using the term cosmos rather than universe because if there are many parallel universes, in the event that we are unable to engage with those other universes, it is also the case that we have no free will. Given an immeasurable number of parallel universes where we have doppelgangers whose lives unfold in ways that are each slightly different from our own, at every significant juncture of our lives, and many other far less significant ones, we will have taken every other possible course of action that we could have taken but did not take in our own lives. This would reduce any and all human decision to absurd meaninglessness. The kind of character formation that is a prerequisite for ethical responsibility would be rendered an entirely random or thoroughly determined outcome of inhuman forces operating across the multiverse. Parallel universes that contain doppelgangers of ourselves only allow for meaningful metaphysical freedom and self-determination if it is, at least in principle, possible to access them and impact the lives of our counterparts in unpredictable ways. This is true not only of the kind of multiverse that we are presented with in the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, but also of the more logical conception of a plurality of worlds, such as the one elaborated by David Lewis. In On the Plurality of Worlds, Lewis engages with one of the most basic and enduring problems in logic. What does it mean to use counterfactuals? According to certain modern logicians, such as Bertrand Russell or the young Wittgenstein, who later repudiated this view, every statement, when analyzed in terms of its fundamental logical structure, has to have reference, the simple objects that are being referred to by atomic propositions, the most irreducible elements of statements. Where are the reference of counterfactual statements, since they are not in this world? Lewis is trying to offer an answer to this conundrum that would not require resorting to conceptions of imaginary worlds, since any conception of the imaginary that would be categorically distinct from the real is itself a notion that could be considered illogical or unanalyzable. So Lewis claims that counterfactuals are referring to objects and state of affairs in other worlds than our own, which worlds must be presumed to really exist, although we cannot get to them. The plurality of worlds are ontologically isolated, so that they can serve as a basis for logical structure and meaningful expression. But this would mean, as in the case of MWI, that many of these other worlds feature counterparts of ours that have made every decision and taken every action other than the ones that we appeared to have chosen in this world, and that the variation is not on account of our own will or intention, but is a causal consequence of the necessary instantiation of every logical possibility in one or another isolated world. Again, this reduces human action and choice to absurdity. To better understand why this is the case, remember that free will is not just randomness. It is not simply acting in a way that you did not make me act, say by means of hypnosis or through manipulating my brain with electrodes that would be akin to puppet strings. It is acting in a way that is an expression of my developing personality in response to experiences that I have gone through. That presupposes that I am determining my life. My life is an act of creation, a work of art, or at least it has the potential to be. This brings us to the second aspect of being bound for freedom, which is its teleological significance. The concept also signifies that being is headed or bound for a hitherto unrealized freedom. On this view, history has an overall trajectory of progressive liberation from oppressive structures. Whether these structures are epistemic, having to do with science and education, or whether they are religious, social, or political. Although the movement forward toward the realization of freedom is by no means simplistically linear, and it may admit of many regresses, there is an overall dialectical progress. This connects back to the first facet of the concept, insofar as it is the fundamental place of freedom in the structure of existence that renders the eventual destructuring of various forms of enslavement inevitable, since they go against the grain of the process of becoming on an ontological level. The ultimate aim or end of this process, which breaks through the crust of repression and regression in any liberating revolution, is the maximization of creativity, or creation of conditions conducive of more creativity. The denial of free will makes nonsense of art and of every act of creation. Works of creative genius, whether in literature, painting, sculpture, architecture, theater, music, or cinema, would have to be seen as farcical materializations of predetermined configurations of elementary particles. Any artist understands that a creative act is exclusive. To fashion a sculpture in a particular way, or paint a painting in a particular manner rather than in another fashion, and to repeatedly repaint a canvas because one is trying to get it right, is an exclusionary act. It cannot be that one has made every choice that one precluded during the course of that act of creation. For every other path to have been taken simultaneously by indefinitely many versions of oneself would destroy the meaningfulness of any work of art, or for that matter of any creative act. Hopefully, this makes it clearer why it must be the case that if there are parallel worlds, for us to retain some kind of creative responsibility for our lives, we would need to be able to access those worlds. Our various counterparts would have to be able to interact with each other in ways that would result in unforeseen developments in their respective lives beyond that point, unforeseen by anyone or by any God. David Lewis makes a remark in On the Plurality of Worlds to the effect that the kind of binary logic where either A or not A have to be true has to be presumed. For it not to be the case that counterfactual referents are referring to states of affairs in other worlds, the world would have to be, quote, like a story, unquote. He claims that we can conceive of all kinds of possible worlds other than this actual world, but all of them ought to be logically consistent and not like the worlds in some imaginary stories. He denies that the world could be inconsistent and revisable in the way that a story is, or have the texture of a dream. A world with free will is a universe that is more like a great story or a grand narrative than it is like a machine. Our task is, moreover, to revise the story of the world in a way that is creatively constructive. A logic that insists on a hard separation between imagination and reality must be rejected, or at least treated as a tool for practical purposes, not as the kind of mirror that its proponents claim can reflect a putatively objective reality. The Greek conception of logos was originally, in archaic times, that of a story, or account, but a story of universal scope and significance. When he started to develop it into a properly philosophical concept, Heraclitus still understood logos as the narrative structure of the cosmos. That kind of narrative structure is similar to the fabric from which our dreams are woven. This also means that reality is revisable in the way that Philip K. Dick thought was possible. Our task as imaginative and creative individuals is daring to dream a better world rather than being resigned to living in a nightmare. So far, then, we have examined two elements of the concept of being bound for freedom. The first is that being, namely the cosmos and the chaos from out of which it emerges, needs to be a process bound or structured in such a way as to allow for freedom. The second is that this structure, which would allow for free will, is future-oriented in such a way that it is bound for or headed towards an ever greater actualization of freedom as expressed in ever more complex forms of creativity. Third and finally, being bound for freedom also means the duty-boundedness of anyone struggling to secure liberty on a socio-political level. It signifies the acceptance of certain bounds or limitations that make the enjoyment of freedom possible, as compared to the sheer chaos and violent anarchy that will never be anything more than a nihilistic vacuum for repressive and paternalistic power structures to fill. An example of this duty-boundness would be the articulation of certain civil rights that enshrine personal freedom and that are binding by law on both the government and citizens. But being bound for freedom in this political sense is also related to the image of Prometheus bound to the rock by the tyrant Zeus, because political revolutions to constitute regimes that secure liberty at a constitutional level inevitably involve the martyrdom and self-sacrifice of revolutionaries who are branded as terrorist rebels before being recognized in hindsight as freedom fighters and founders of the new order. It follows that being bound for freedom also means submitting to a certain discipline and being willing to accept particular limitations which are intended to socially and politically safeguard the exercise and expression of this metaphysical freedom against the threat of various types of tyranny. The best example of this kind of limitation is the conception of natural right, or the, quote, inalienable rights of man, unquote, that lies at the foundation of the Constitution of the United States. Before taking a look at this, it should be noted that this sense of being bound for freedom also signifies the way in which Prometheus winds up being bound by Zeus, namely chained to a rock in the Caucasus to be punished by the bird of prey perpetually pecking at his liver. Prometheus is the liberator of humanity, the ultimate champion of human self-determination, fighting to protect freedom, including to protect it from that majoritarian form of tyranny known as democracy, is also a willingness to be bound in chains or to suffer punishment in the name of this cause. That was certainly the case with the best of the American founders, above all, Thomas Paine, whose writings most clearly and unequivocally formulate the doctrine of the rights of man without any trace of hypocrisy. If we look back at the ideology upon which the United States was founded, by a group of brilliant men wielding serious intellectual firepower, when these men stood in defense of the inalienable rights of man, their conception of this was based upon certain metaphysical presuppositions about the nature of the cosmos. The founders of the United States hated democracy. They thought that the majority of people were an unthinking herd, a mindless mob, which the enterprising and creative individual needed to be defended against. These are people who articulated the ideals of liberty as a defense against what they called tyranny of the majority, namely democracy. The rights enshrined in our Bill of Rights are inalienable. They cannot be legitimately taken away by any government or any social majority because, according to the American founders, rights are not socially constructed. We are endowed by nature, or as they sometimes put it, nature's God, quote unquote, with a certain character, a certain ethos which stands in a relationship with the nature of the universe. Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, Paine, and their associates believed in a relationship between the microcosm of man and the macrocosm of the universe. They had the conception of a clockmaker God who designed the universe with a certain reason that is also reflected in the mind of man, and man has the capacity to develop his reason and be more effective in this rational universe. Although they are elaborating this view at a time before the Darwinian theory of evolution, it is possible to reconceive of the kind of basis for inalienable rights that these men were reaching toward after the recognition of biological evolution. The founding fathers of America unconsciously intuited the incentive structure involved in evolutionary optimization, and not simply in terms of capitalist economics and how efficient it is at generating industrial productivity. Rather, also in terms of how capable this kind of system is in promoting creativity. There are a lot of deleterious elements to American popular culture and mass media consumerism, but the socio-political parameters that were established by men like Jefferson, Paine, and Franklin also allowed for the tremendous artistic creativity that we saw take place in America in geniuses like Frank Lloyd Wright, Jackson Pollock, and Philip K. Dick. In order for there to be inalienable rights of the kind that America's founders imagined as the basis for the United States Constitution, one has to have a conception of evolution wherein the future is radically undetermined, so that even if there is a God, that God cannot definitively know all that is going to happen in the future. One has to have a cosmos that is open in a way where there is no completed logical space. This would mean that evolution is teleological, but that the imperative of evolution is infinite creativity. Evolution is open-ended in a way that promotes an arising of infinitely various forms, and the kind of efficiency and effectiveness that is aimed at by evolution is not the kind that is characteristic of a beehive. Rather, it is an effectiveness in the sense of competition for ever more creative configurations of life. If that is the kind of imperative intrinsic to the evolutionary process on a cosmic scale, then it means something to say that there are inalienable rights, quote unquote. Inalienable in the sense that they are irrevocable civil rights. Those rights effectively become the social and political preconditions for maximizing our evolutionary potential.